All right, 13.1, potential board action on the personal consent agenda. We have Samer Hammam is our new database and technical services facilitator, starting employment retroactive back to March 8th. We also have additional substitute teachers. We are going to pull out Layla Rupert, but we have Sabrine Side, Kennedy Williams, and Cassandra Carey. Can we have a motion to approve the consent agenda?
I'll make the motion to approve the consent agenda. Second.
Mrs. Grove,
Aye.
Mrs. Petropoulos,
Aye.
Mrs. Lammle,
Aye.
Mrs. Lebudzic,
Aye.
and Mrs. Salzer.
Aye.
All right, 13.2, notification of resignations. We have 5 that are here, 4 that were listed previously, and 1 that we received on Friday after the agenda was created. We have Deborah Jennings, school counselor at Finley Junior High, effective June 9th. Nicholas Labenda, PE teacher at Finley Junior High, effective June 9th. Jolene Platt, school counselor at Finley Junior High, effective June 9th. Nathan Rail, school counselor at Ridge Lawn, effective June 9th. And Bill Howard, he was float custodian, and that was effective immediately. And I believe he handed that in last Friday, March 10th. Okay. 13.3, potential board action on resolution releasing closed session minutes and destruction of verbatim recordings 18 months and older. Can we get a motion?
I'll make the motion. Second.
Mrs. Lammle,
Aye.
Mrs. Grove,
Aye.
Mrs. Lebudzic,
Aye.
Mrs. Petropoulos,
Aye.
and Mrs. Salzer.
Aye.
13.4, potential action authorizing a tuition reimbursement contract for Catherine King, principal at Ridge Central School, to complete the doctoral program in educational leadership at the University of St. Francis. Can we get a motion?
I'll make the motion. I'll second the motion.
Mrs. Petropoulos,
Aye.
Mrs. Lammle,
Aye.
Mrs. Lebudzic,
Aye.
and Mrs. Salzer.
Aye.
13, I
Got
did.
you
Mrs. Grove.
Aye.
Thank you.
Ooh, you might need.
Well,
glasses.
because I had crossed out the ones and then I had even circled you to remind myself. I did. Sorry. 13.5, potential board action to approve administrative contracts for school year 23-24. We have Kathy Picciolini, Chief School Business Official, Megan Nothnagel, Curriculum Director, Carrie Hilligans, Director of Pupil Personal Services, Caroline Brucheri, Bilingual EL Coordinator, Catherine King, Principal at Ridge Central, Emily Geyer, Assistant Principal at Ridge Central, Jeff Youngberg, Principal at Finley, Julie Bazian, Assistant Principal at Finley, Leanne Kismerick, Assistant Principal at Ridge Lawn, and then we have pre-K and Principal Mentor stipends for Fran Sotaro. Can we get a motion?
I'll make the motion. I'll second it.
Mrs. Grove,
Aye.
Mrs. Lebudzic,
Aye.
Mrs. Petropoulos,
Aye.
Mrs. Lammle,
Aye.
and Mrs. Salzer.
Aye.
13.6, potential board action to approve the superintendent's contract for Dr. Adam Thorns for school year 23-24 through school year 27-28.
I'll make the motion. I'll second the motion.
Mrs. Lebudzic,
Aye.
Mrs. Grove,
Aye.
Mrs. Lammle,
Aye.
Mrs. Petropoulos,
Aye.
and Mrs. Salzer.
Aye.
And I'd like to stop and just thank the board. Again, I know obviously once April hits, we're gonna have some big changes. And then we're gonna have some board members that we are searching for and bringing in. So
Hopefully we found one.
yeah, I've really enjoyed my time in this past 2 years with everyone and can't wait to continue and see where we take the district. So thank you very much.
Thank
Yeah. Oh, and our last one, 14.0, can we get a motion to adjourn?
I'll make the motion. I'll second.
Mrs. Lammle,
Aye.
Mrs. Petropoulos,
Aye.
Mrs. Grove,
Aye.
Mrs. Lebudzic,
Aye.
and Mrs. Salzer.
Aye.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Right, that's it.